You think you know what hell looks like? You imagine it with flames and demons, don't you? But I've seen the real hell, and it floats. It creaks with every wave, it reeks of human despair, and it's filled with the living dead who once thought, just like you, that they could survive anything. Tonight, while you sit comfortably believing that medieval sea travel was just uncomfortable, I'm going to show you what really happened on those floating coffins they called ships. And when I'm done, you'll never look at the ocean the same way again, because you'll know what lies beneath those romantic tales of brave explorers and merchant adventurers. You'll know why most of them never came back. Let me whisper something in your ear that the history books won't tell you. When a medieval ship left port, the crew didn't say goodbye to their families. They said farewell. There's a difference, and that difference is hope. These men knew, deep in their bones, that they were probably going to die. Not might die, not could die, but probably would die. The statistics don't lie, even when everything else does. In the 13th century, for every 10 ships that left European ports for long voyages, only 6 returned. And of those 6, half came back with less than a third of their original crew. Do the math. That's not adventure, that's mass suicide with extra steps. But here's what really happened to those missing men, and why you would have been among them. The ocean didn't just kill them quickly and mercifully. Oh no, the sea has patience, and it savors its meals. It starts with your mind first, then your body, then your soul, in that exact order, and by the time you realize what's happening, you're already too far gone to do anything but scream into the endless blue that doesn't care about your suffering. Picture this. You're standing on a dock in Portsmouth, 1347. The Black Death is ravaging Europe, but you've heard rumors of untold riches in the East. Spices worth more than gold, silks that feel like liquid dreams, jewels that could buy you a kingdom. All you have to do is survive a little sea voyage. How hard could it be? You hand over your life savings to a ship captain whose smile doesn't reach his eyes, and you step aboard what you think is your ticket to fortune. What you've actually done is bought yourself a first-class passage to a nightmare that would make Dante weep. The ship is smaller than your garage. No, really. The average medieval merchant vessel was about 60 feet long and maybe 20 feet wide. Now imagine cramming 30 to 50 men into that space, along with months of supplies, cargo, and everything else needed for a voyage that could last anywhere from 3 months to 2 years. You can't stand up straight anywhere except on deck. You can't lie down fully extended. You can't escape the smell of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and human waste. And this is just day one. But the space isn't what kills you first. It's the water. Not the ocean around you, but the water you drink. Medieval ships carried their fresh water in wooden barrels, and those barrels were breeding grounds for every disease known to man and several that weren't. Within a week, your drinking water would be green with algae, thick with slime, and crawling with things that had no business being inside a human body. But you drank it anyway, because the alternative was dying of thirst. So instead, you died slowly of everything else. The ship's surgeon, if you were lucky enough to have one, carried a medicine chest that would horrify a modern veterinarian, mercury for syphilis, which would poison you faster than the disease itself. Lead-based compounds for stomach ailments that would give you brain damage before they gave you relief. And bloodletting, always bloodletting, because clearly what a man dying of dehydration and malnutrition needed was to lose more blood. The cure was often worse than the disease, and the disease was already a death sentence. Then there's the food, if you can call it that. Salt pork that was more salt than pork. Hardtack biscuits so infested with weevils that sailors would tap them on the table to make the bugs fall out before eating them anyway. The ship's stores of cheese and butter would turn rancid within weeks, developing a flavor that one medieval chronicler described as the taste of death itself. But you ate it because starving to death was worse than food poisoning, or so you thought until you experienced both simultaneously. The rats were your competition for these delicacies, and the rats were winning. They multiplied faster than you could kill them, and they were smarter than you gave them credit for. They knew which parts of the ship were safest during storms. They knew which food stores were freshest. They knew somehow when death was coming for a crew member, and they would gather around his hammock like tiny, furry undertakers waiting for their next meal. Sometimes they didn't wait for you to die first. But the physical conditions were just the opening act. The real horror show began when you realized that you were trapped in a floating prison with men who had been driven mad by months at sea. Scurvy didn't just make your teeth fall out and your wounds refuse to heal. It made you insane. Literally, clinically insane. Vitamin C deficiency causes hallucinations, paranoia, and violent psychotic episodes. Now imagine being locked in a tiny space with 20 other men experiencing the same mental breakdown. And every single one of them has access to knives, axes, and other sharp implements necessary for shipboard life. The ship's log of the merchant vessel St. Catherine, which attempted a voyage to Constantinople in 1302, records 14 separate incidents of crew members attacking each other with deadly intent. Not arguments, not fights, but attempted murders driven by scurvy-induced madness. The captain notes in handwriting that becomes increasingly erratic as the voyage progresses that he began chaining men to the mast not as punishment, but to protect them from each other. By the time the ship limped back to port, Half the crew was dead, and the other half was so traumatized that several took holy orders rather than ever set foot on another ship. And then there were the storms. Medieval ships weren't built to withstand the fury of the open ocean. They were floating compromises between cargo space and structural integrity, and when the weather turned nasty, you discovered just how badly that compromise could end. The hull would flex and twist like a living thing in agony, opening seams that let in water faster than you could bail it out. The mast would crack and sway, threatening to come crashing down and crush anyone unlucky enough to be beneath it. And through it all, you would be thrown around like a rag doll, slamming into walls, cargo, and other crew members with enough force to break bones and rupture organs. But even if you survived the storm, you had to deal with the aftermath. Ships that had been barely seaworthy before the tempest were now actively trying to sink. Pumping water became a 24-hour job, with crew members working in shifts until they collapsed from exhaustion. Food stores that had been contaminated with seawater became completely inedible. Freshwater barrels that had been cracked or contaminated meant that your already limited supply was now even more precious and even more deadly. The cold was another killer that stalked you day and night. Medieval sailors had no concept of proper cold weather gear. They wore wool that would soak through and stay wet for weeks, leather that would freeze solid and crack, and linen that provided about as much protection as tissue paper. Frostbite was so common that ship surgeons carried special saws for amputating frozen fingers and toes. Hypothermia killed men in their sleeps, and their shipmates would wake up next to corpses that had frozen solid during the night. Navigation was more guesswork than science. Your captain might know generally where he was going, but he had no reliable way to determine exactly where he was at any given moment. The magnetic compass was a new invention that many captains didn't trust, and even if they did, it could be thrown off by iron deposits, electrical storms, or simple manufacturing defects. Dead reckoning was the primary method of navigation, which meant keeping track of your speed and direction and hoping your calculations were correct. They usually weren't. Ships regularly sailed for weeks or months in the wrong direction, burning through their supplies while getting further and further from their destination. Some vessels became so lost that they wandered the oceans like Flying Dutchmen, their crews slowly dying of starvation and thirst while still technically under sail. The lucky ones died quickly. The unlucky ones resorted to cannibalism, starting with the dead crew members and eventually moving on to the living ones who were too weak to resist. This brings us to one of the most horrifying aspects of medieval sea travel, the breakdown of human civilization that occurred when men were pushed beyond their limits. Ship's articles, the legal documents that governed behavior aboard vessels, contained explicit provisions for dealing with mutiny, murder, and cannibalism. Not because these were rare occurrences, but because they were common enough that legal frameworks were necessary to address them. The ship's captain held absolute authority, but that authority was only as strong as his ability to enforce it. A captain who became too sick, too weak, or too unpopular could find himself the victim of a mutiny that would make modern prison riots look like Sunday school picnics. Mutineers didn't just remove their captain from command. They tortured him as a way of releasing months of pent-up frustration and rage. Ship's logs record captains being keel-hauled, a punishment that involved dragging a man under the ship's hull, where the barnacles would flay the skin from his body before he drowned. But mutiny was just the beginning. When food ran out, as it inevitably did on voyages that went wrong, the crew faced choices that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, however short those lives might be. Maritime law actually had provisions for cannibalism, including rules about who could be eaten first, usually the sick and wounded, and how the selection should be made, often by drawing lots. This wasn't theoretical, it was practical guidance for a situation that occurred with disturbing regularity. The psychological toll of these experiences was something that medieval medicine had no way to address. Men who survived long voyages often returned home as hollow shells of their former selves, unable to sleep without nightmares, unable to eat without remembering the taste of human flesh, unable to look at the ocean without seeing the faces of shipmates they had watched die. Many became hermits or entered monasteries, seeking salvation for sins they had been forced to commit in order to survive. And through it all, the ocean waited with infinite patience. It knew that time was on its side, that eventually every ship would make a mistake. Every crew would reach their breaking point. Every voyage would end in tragedy. The sea collected its due in installments, a man here, a ship there, an entire fleet when it was feeling particularly hungry. It was a predator that hunted with weather and disease, with starvation and madness, with all the tools that nature had given it to harvest the lives of men who dared to challenge its dominion. So when you dream of adventure on the high seas, when you imagine yourself as a bold explorer or wealthy merchant, remember this: the ocean has been keeping score for centuries, and it's winning by a margin that would make a genocide look like a minor disagreement. The men who sailed those medieval ships weren't heroes or adventurers. They were desperate, and desperation makes people do things that would horrify them under normal circumstances. But this is just the beginning of your education in maritime horror. We've barely scratched the surface of what awaited you on those floating hells. The disease, the violence, the madness, the starvation, these were just the opening movements in a symphony of suffering that could last for months or even years. Because once you were at sea, once you were beyond sight of land, you belonged to the ocean, and the ocean never let go of what belonged to it. Now let me tell you about the diseases that turned these ships into floating plague houses, because what I'm about to reveal will make you understand why medieval sailors prayed not for safe passage, but for quick deaths. The medical ignorance of the time wasn't just unfortunate, it was actively murderous, turning every minor ailment into a death sentence and every treatment into torture. Scurvy wasn't just bleeding gums and loose teeth, though that's the sanitized version they teach children. The reality was that your body began consuming itself from the inside out. Your old wounds would reopen spontaneously, bleeding as if they were fresh. Your bones would soften until they could no longer support your weight, leaving you a writhing mass of agony on the ship's deck. Your hair would fall out in clumps, taking pieces of scalp with it. And your mind, oh, your precious rational mind, would fragment into pieces like a shattered mirror, each shard reflecting a different horror. The ship's surgeon would treat scurvy by forcing you to drink your own urine, believing that the body's waste contained healing properties. He might also prescribe a mixture of gunpowder and wine, or force you to swallow mercury, which would poison your nervous system while doing absolutely nothing for the vitamin deficiency that was actually killing you. The treatment was often more agonizing than the disease, but the surgeon was convinced he was saving your life even as he hastened your death. But scurvy was just one member of a whole family of maritime diseases that competed to see which could cause the most suffering. Dysentery turned your bowels into a faucet of blood and mucus that couldn't be turned off. You would lose control of your bodily functions completely, soiling yourself constantly while your intestines slowly liquefied. The smell was so overwhelming that healthy crew members would vomit just from being near you, creating a chain reaction of sickness that could incapacitate half the ship. The ship's latrine, such as it was, consisted of a plank with holes in it, suspended over the side of the vessel. In calm weather, this was merely humiliating. In rough seas, it became a death trap. Men weakened by dysentery would lose their grip and fall into the ocean, too weak to swim and too far from help to be rescued. The crew would watch them drown while being unable to do anything about it. Another psychological scar to add to their growing collection. Typhus, carried by the lice that infested every piece of clothing and bedding on the ship, caused fever so intense that men would beg to be thrown overboard just to cool their burning bodies. The disease attacked the brain, causing hallucinations so vivid that sailors would see dead relatives beckoning them from the waves. Some would answer that call, climbing over the rail and diving into the ocean with smiles on their faces, finally free from the agony of their fevered delusions. The ship's surgeon would treat typhus by bleeding the patient, often taking so much blood that the cure killed faster than the disease. He might also prescribe trepanation, drilling holes in the skull to release evil spirits, a procedure performed without anesthesia, using tools that were also used to repair the ship's rigging. The screams could be heard throughout the vessel, and many crew members would stuff cloth in their ears to block out the sound of their shipmate being tortured in the name of medicine. Then there was the flux, a catch-all term for any number of intestinal parasites that would take up residence in your digestive system and slowly eat you alive from the inside. These weren't just uncomfortable. They were intelligent predators that had evolved specifically to exploit human hosts. They would time their reproduction cycles to coincide with your body's weakest moments, multiplying by the millions just when you thought you might be recovering. The most horrifying aspect of these parasites was that they could control your behavior. Infected sailors would develop cravings for raw meat, fresh blood, and other substances that would help the parasites thrive. Ship's logs record crew members catching rats and eating them alive, or cutting themselves to drink their own blood, all while believing they were making rational choices about their diet. The parasites had hijacked their brains, turning them into puppets that existed solely to serve their microscopic masters. Medieval ship surgeons had no understanding of germs or infection, so their standard treatment for any wound was to pack it with whatever was handy. Tar, gunpowder, salt, or even human hair. These substances would introduce new infections while doing nothing to treat the original injury. A simple cut that should have healed in days would fester for weeks, eventually becoming so infected that the limb would have to be amputated with a saw that had been used to cut wood and rope without being cleaned. Amputation aboard a medieval ship was a nightmare that defied description. The patient would be held down by several crew members while the surgeon used whatever tools were available, often a carpenter's saw and a cook's cleaver. There was no anesthesia except for alcohol, which was usually reserved for the surgeon rather than the patient. The wound would be cauterized with a red-hot iron, filling the air with the smell of burning flesh and the sound of screaming that could drive other crew members insane. But even if you survived the surgery, infection was almost guaranteed. The surgical tools were never sterilized, the operating area was contaminated with filth, and post-operative care consisted of wrapping the stump in whatever cloth was available and hoping for the best. Most amputation patients died within days from blood poisoning, but not before experiencing agony that modern medicine can barely imagine. The ship's medicine chest was a collection of horrors that would have impressed the Spanish Inquisition. Mercury for treating syphilis, which was so toxic that the treatment would kill you long before the disease had a chance to. Lead-based compounds for stomach ailments that would cause brain damage and insanity, arsenic for treating skin conditions, administered in doses that were often lethal, And always, always the cupping glasses and bleeding knives, because medieval medicine was convinced that every ailment could be cured by draining the patient's blood. Bloodletting was performed for everything from headaches to broken bones, often removing so much blood that the patient would go into shock and die. The ship's surgeon would make cuts in the patient's arms, legs, or neck, and let the blood drain into bowls, sometimes taking several pints from a man who was already weakened by malnutrition and disease. The theory was that bad blood caused illness, so removing blood would cure the patient. In practice, it usually just hastened their death. The psychological effects of watching your shipmates receive these treatments were almost as devastating as the treatments themselves. You would know that if you became sick or injured, you would be subjected to the same tortures in the name of healing. This knowledge created a culture of secrecy around illness, with crew members hiding symptoms until they were too sick to conceal them any longer. By then, it was usually too late for any treatment, even the barbaric ones available. Ship captains, aware that medical treatment was often worse than no treatment at all, sometimes forbade the ship's surgeon from practicing altogether. This led to a black market in folk remedies and superstitious practices that were often just as dangerous as official medicine. Sailors would treat wounds with spiderwebs, broken bones with poultices made from rotted fish, and internal ailments with concoctions brewed from seawater and their own waste products. The isolation of being at sea meant that epidemic diseases could sweep through a ship's crew with nothing to stop them. When one man contracted typhus, dysentery, or any other infectious disease, it was only a matter of time before the entire crew was affected. Ships would become floating hospitals where the healthy were indistinguishable from the sick, and the living were barely distinguishable from the dead. The bodies of those who died from disease couldn't always be buried at sea immediately. In rough weather or during battles with pirates, corpses would be stacked in the ship's hold like cordwood, decomposing slowly in the darkness, while the survivors continued to live and work just a few feet above them. The smell of rotting flesh would permeate every part of the ship, and the psychological effect of knowing that dead bodies were beneath your feet was enough to drive some men insane. When bodies were finally committed to the sea, there was rarely time for proper ceremony. The dead would be wrapped in whatever cloth was available, weighted with stones or pieces of iron, and pushed overboard with minimal fanfare. But the ocean wasn't always willing to accept these offerings. Bodies would sometimes float alongside the ship for days, bloated and decomposing, serving as a constant reminder of what awaited the living crew members. The ship's rats, meanwhile, thrived in this environment of death and disease. They would feast on the bodies of the dead, growing fat and bold while the living crew members starved. These rats became carriers of every disease on the ship, spreading infection faster than any human vector could. They would bite sleeping sailors, contaminate food stores, and leave droppings that turned the entire ship into a biological weapon aimed at its own crew. Disease wasn't just a medical problem on medieval ships. It was a social and psychological catastrophe that destroyed the bonds between crew members. Men who had been friends would turn on each other when resources became scarce. The sick would be abandoned by the healthy, left to die alone in whatever corner of the ship they could crawl to. The healthy would live in constant fear of contagion, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust that was almost as toxic as the diseases themselves. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect of maritime disease was how it stripped away everything that made the victims human. Men reduced to animals by pain and fever would fight over scraps of rotten food, attack their shipmates for imagined slights, and abandon all pretense of civilization in their desperate struggle to survive. The ship became not just a vehicle for transportation, but a laboratory for studying how quickly human beings could devolve into something unrecognizable. And through it all, the ocean watched with the patience of a predator that knew its prey had nowhere to run. Every cough, every fever, every infected wound was another victory for the sea, another step closer to claiming the entire crew for its vast underwater cemetery. The diseases weren't just biological processes, they were weapons in the ocean's arsenal perfectly designed to exploit the weaknesses of men who dared to challenge its dominion. This medical nightmare was just another layer of the hell that awaited anyone foolish enough to believe they could survive a medieval sea voyage. But we're still not done exploring the depths of maritime horror, because the diseases were just one way the ocean killed its victims. There were so many others, each more creative and cruel than the last. Let me tell you about the violence that erupted when civilized men were stripped of everything that made them civilized. Because what I'm about to reveal will show you that the real monsters on these ships weren't mythical sea creatures. They were the men who started the voyage as your friends, your colleagues, your brothers in adventure. By the end, they would become something else entirely, something that would haunt your nightmares if you lived long enough to have them. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual dissolution that began with small compromises and ended with acts of savagery that would make barbarians weep. It started with the simple matter of food distribution. When supplies ran low, as they inevitably did, decisions had to be made about who ate and who didn't. These decisions were supposedly based on rank and usefulness to the ship's operation, but in reality they were determined by violence and the threat of violence. The ship's officers would eat first, always. Not because they deserved it more, but because they had weapons and the authority to use them. The common sailors would fight over the scraps, and these fights were not the theatrical brawls you see in movies. They were desperate animalistic struggles, where men would gouge out eyes, bite off fingers, and use whatever makeshift weapons they could find to secure another day of survival. I've read accounts from the merchant vessel Holy Virgin, which attempted a trading run to the Black Sea in 1356. The ship's clerk, a man named Brother Thomas, who somehow survived to write about his experiences, describes a fight over a piece of moldy bread that lasted 3 hours and left 2 men dead and 5 others permanently maimed. The bread, he notes with dark humor, was so rotten that the rats wouldn't touch it, but the men fought over it like it was made of gold. The ship's weapons were supposedly locked away, but desperation is a master locksmith. Knives disappeared from the galley, tools vanished from the carpenter's kit, and anything that could be sharpened into a blade found its way into someone's hands. The captain would conduct searches, but the men had become expert at hiding weapons in places where no sane person would look, sewn into clothing, concealed in body cavities, wrapped around limbs beneath bandages. When the violence escalated beyond simple fights over food, the ship's justice system revealed itself to be even more brutal than the crimes it was meant to punish. Maritime law gave the captain absolute authority to maintain order, and medieval captains interpreted this authority with a creativity that would impress modern dictators. Flogging was the mildest punishment, administered with knotted ropes that would strip the flesh from a man's back in bloody ribbons. But flogging was for minor infractions. Serious crimes called for serious punishments, and medieval ship captains had developed an entire catalog of tortures, specifically designed for maritime use. Keel hauling, where a man would be tied to a rope and dragged under the ship's hull, was nominally intended to clean the barnacles off the vessel's bottom. In practice, it was a death sentence carried out slowly and publicly, as the victim's body would be shredded by the razor-sharp shells until nothing remained but bloody rags. The most horrifying aspect of maritime punishment was how it turned the entire crew into accomplices. Everyone was required to participate in the execution of justice, whether they wanted to or not. If you refused to help tie the knots for keel hauling, you might find yourself on the receiving end of the same punishment. If you showed mercy to a condemned man, you would be accused of mutiny and face even worse consequences. This system of collective punishment created a psychological prison that was more effective than any physical restraint. Every crew member became complicit in every atrocity, bound together by shared guilt and the knowledge that they could be next. The ship became a floating totalitarian state where survival depended not on competence or loyalty, but on the ability to inflict suffering on others when commanded to do so. But even the captain's authority had limits, and when those limits were reached, the results were catastrophic. Mutiny wasn't just about removing an unpopular commander. It was about releasing months or years of accumulated rage and frustration in an explosion of violence that would make modern prison riots look like polite disagreements. The mutineers didn't just kill their officers. They tortured them slowly, methodically, as a way of purging themselves of all the humiliation and suffering they had endured. The ship's log of the trading vessel, St. Barbara, records a mutiny that began in 1398 and lasted for 6 days. The crew had been at sea for 18 months, far longer than originally planned, and their supplies had run out 3 months earlier. The captain and his officers had been hoarding food while the common sailors starved, and when this was discovered, the explosion was inevitable. The mutineers didn't just kill the captain, they dismembered him while he was still alive, feeding pieces of his body to the ship's rats while he watched. They forced the first mate to eat his own fingers before drowning him in a barrel of the contaminated water that had poisoned half the crew. The ship's surgeon was subjected to every medical procedure he had ever inflicted on others, including trepanation, performed with a rusty nail. But mutiny was just one form of violence among many. The close quarters and constant stress created a breeding ground for every form of human cruelty imaginable. Sexual violence was endemic, with the strong preying on the weak in ways that turned the ship into a floating prison where rape was just another tool of dominance and control. The victims had nowhere to run, no authority to appeal to, and no hope of escape until the voyage ended, if it ever ended. The ship's boys, usually children between the ages of 10 and 14 who were apprenticed to learn seamanship, were particularly vulnerable. They were small, weak, and completely dependent on the adult crew members for protection. When that protection failed, as it often did, these children would be subjected to abuse that would scar them for life, assuming they survived long enough to carry those scars. But perhaps the most disturbing form of violence was what happened when the food ran out completely. Cannibalism wasn't just a last resort. It was a systematic process with its own rules and rituals that revealed just how far human beings could fall when pushed to their absolute limits. The selection of victims wasn't random. It followed a hierarchy based on usefulness, social status, and the ability to fight back. The sick and wounded were eaten first, naturally. They were going to die anyway, the reasoning went, so it made sense to use their bodies to keep the healthy alive. But the definition of sick became increasingly flexible as hunger gnawed at the crew's sanity. A man with a minor injury might find himself marked for consumption. Someone who complained too much about conditions might be declared mentally unfit and therefore expendable. The process of butchering human beings for food required tools and techniques that the crew had to develop through trial and error. The ship's cook, if he was still alive, would take charge of the operation, treating human bodies like any other meat that needed to be prepared for consumption. Limbs would be jointed and sectioned, organs would be removed and sorted, and everything would be distributed according to the ship's hierarchy of survival. The psychological impact of eating human flesh was devastating, but hunger is a more powerful motivator than revulsion. Men who had started the voyage as devout Christians would find themselves fighting over who got to eat the heart, the liver, the brain, the organs that were richest in nutrients and most likely to keep them alive for another few days. They would save the bones to make soup, crack them open to suck out the marrow, and use every part of their former shipmates' bodies to sustain their own. But cannibalism created its own problems. Human meat, especially from people who had died of disease, was often contaminated with the same pathogens that had killed the original host. The cannibals would contract new diseases from their meals, creating a cycle of death and consumption that accelerated the crew's destruction. Ship's logs record instances where the act of eating the dead killed more people than starvation would. The rituals that developed around cannibalism were perhaps more disturbing than the act itself. Some crews would hold mock funeral services before butchering their dead, as if the ceremony could somehow sanctify what they were about to do. Others would pray over the bodies, asking God's forgiveness for what necessity had driven them to. A few developed elaborate systems of lots and voting to determine who would be killed next when the supply of natural deaths ran out. The transition from eating the already dead to killing the living was not as difficult as you might imagine. Once a crew had crossed the line into cannibalism, the moral barriers that separated civilization from savagery had been permanently breached. Men who had shared meals made from their former friends found it easier to justify creating new sources of food when the old ones were exhausted. The selection process for these living sacrifices revealed the true nature of shipboard society stripped of all pretense. The weak, the unpopular, the foreign, the different, these were the first to be marked for death. But as the crew continued to dwindle, the criteria became more arbitrary. A man might be killed because he snored too loudly, because he had brown eyes instead of blue, or because someone else wanted his shoes. The actual killing was often done by lottery, with the condemned man required to participate in the drawing of lots that would determine his fate. This was considered more fair than having the crew simply murder whoever they wanted to eat, but the psychological torture of watching your own death sentence being drawn from a hat was its own form of cruelty. But even these extreme measures often weren't enough to save the survivors. Ships would be found drifting with one or two men left alive, surrounded by the bones and remains of their former crew. These survivors were often completely insane, unable to speak coherently about their experiences or even remember their own names. They had been broken so completely by what they had witnessed and participated in that they were no longer recognizably human. The few survivors who retained enough sanity to tell their stories were usually considered unreliable witnesses, their accounts dismissed as the ravings of men driven mad by their ordeals. This suited everyone just fine, because the alternative, accepting that these horrors were real and could happen again, was too terrifying for civilized society to contemplate. And yet these voyages continued, because the profits were too tempting and the alternatives too limited. Each new crew would convince themselves that they were different, that they were stronger, that they would never sink to such depths. They were wrong, of course, but they wouldn't discover that until it was too late to do anything but join the ranks of the dead and the damned who had gone before them. The ocean knew this, of course. It had been watching the same drama play out for centuries, with only the names and faces changing. It understood human nature better than humans understood themselves, knew exactly how much pressure was required to turn saints into sinners and brothers into cannibals, and it applied that pressure with the patience of a predator that had all the time in the world to perfect its craft. But the ocean didn't rely solely on human weakness to claim its victims. It had other weapons in its arsenal, environmental horrors that would make the violence between crew members seem like a gentle disagreement. Let me tell you about the natural forces that turned these wooden ships into splinters and their crews into fish food, because what you're about to learn will make you understand why medieval sailors didn't fear death. They feared the ocean's creativity in delivering it. The storms weren't just bad weather. They were manifestations of rage that seemed personally directed at anyone foolish enough to challenge the sea's dominion. Medieval ships were built like floating compromises between ambition and physics, and when the ocean decided to test those compromises, the results were catastrophic in ways that modern maritime disasters can't match. Picture yourself aboard the merchant vessel Divine Providence in the North Atlantic, November 1389. You've been at sea for 6 weeks, and the weather has been growing progressively worse. The wind isn't just blowing, it's screaming with a voice that sounds almost human, almost intelligent, as if the storm itself is angry at your presumption in thinking you could cross its domain safely. The waves aren't just large, they're mountains of water that move with purpose, each one larger than the last, as if the ocean is testing your ship's limits before delivering the killing blow. The ship climbs these liquid mountains with agonizing slowness, its wooden hull groaning and flexing in ways that make you wonder if the next wave will be the one that breaks it in half. And then you reach the crest, and for just a moment you can see the full scope of the storm spread out around you like a vision of the apocalypse, waves stretching to the horizon, each one capable of swallowing your ship whole. Lightning that illuminates the chaos in stark, terrifying detail before plunging you back into darkness. And in that darkness, you hear something that will haunt you for the rest of your life. The sound of your ship beginning to come apart. It starts with the rigging. The ropes that hold the masts and sails in place aren't just breaking, they're snapping like bowstrings under tension that was never meant to be endured. Each broken line whips through the air like a weapon, capable of cutting a man in half or taking his head clean off his shoulders. The crew tries to secure the loose rigging, but working in the storm means exposing yourself to forces that can kill you in dozens of different ways. The mast itself begins to sway and crack, a sound like thunder that you feel in your bones as much as you hear it. When it finally goes, it doesn't just fall, it crashes down with the weight of a falling tree, crushing anyone unlucky enough to be beneath it, and punching holes in the deck that let in even more water. The sail, if it hasn't been shredded to ribbons by the wind, becomes a deadly whip that can snap bones and crush skulls. But the real terror begins when the hull starts to flex. Medieval ships were held together with wooden pegs, iron nails, and prayer, none of which were designed to withstand the kind of stress that a major storm could generate. The ship would twist and bend like a living thing in agony, opening seams that let in water faster than any crew could bail it out. The pumps, such as they were, consisted of men working in shifts to operate primitive devices that were barely adequate in calm weather. In a storm, with the ship taking on water from multiple sources and the crew fighting just to stay upright, the pumps became exercises in futility. You would work until your hands bled and your back felt like it was breaking, knowing that you were falling further behind with every stroke. The cargo would break loose and become a lethal hazard, sliding back and forth across the ship's interior with each wave, crushing anything in its path. Barrels of wine, sacks of grain, bales of cloth. Everything would become a projectile weighing hundreds of pounds, smashing through bulkheads and turning the ship's hold into a deadly pinball machine where you were the ball, and through it all, the water kept coming in. Not just from above, where the waves would crash over the deck and pour down through every opening, but from below, where the ship's hull was being slowly torn apart by forces that medieval engineering had never been designed to resist. The water was cold, so cold that it would numb your hands and feet within minutes, making it impossible to work effectively, even if there had been anything useful to do. But the worst part wasn't the immediate danger. It was the knowledge that you were completely helpless. There was no Coast Guard to rescue you, no radio to call for help, no GPS to tell you where you were or how far you were from safety. You were alone in a hostile environment that wanted you dead, with nothing between you and oblivion except a few inches of wood that was already beginning to fail. The psychological impact of being in a major storm was often more devastating than the physical damage. Men would be reduced to gibbering terror, praying to gods they had never believed in before, making bargains with the devil himself if it meant surviving another hour. The ship would be filled with the sound of grown men weeping, screaming and begging for mercy from an ocean that had never shown mercy to anyone. Some would go completely insane, their minds unable to process the scale of the forces arrayed against them. They would tear off their clothes and dive overboard, convinced that swimming was safer than staying on the disintegrating ship. Others would become catatonic, sitting motionless while chaos raged around them, their minds retreating to some inner sanctuary where the storm couldn't reach them. But storms weren't the only environmental hazard that medieval sailors faced. The ocean itself was home to creatures that seemed designed specifically to terrify anyone foolish enough to venture into their domain. And I'm not talking about mythical sea monsters. I'm talking about very real animals that were perfectly capable of destroying ships and devouring their crews. Giant squids weren't legends. They were documented threats that could grow to lengths of 60 feet or more, with tentacles strong enough to crush a ship's hull and beaks sharp enough to bite through wood and bone with equal ease. Ships would be attacked without warning, tentacles erupting from the depths to wrap around masts and drag the entire vessel beneath the waves. The crew of the trading ship St. Michael reported an encounter with such a creature in 1402, somewhere off the coast of Norway. The beast attacked at night when most of the crew was asleep, its tentacles sliding silently over the rail like massive snakes. The first man to spot it had time for one scream before a tentacle wrapped around his waist and pulled him overboard. The creature then began systematically destroying the ship, crushing the hull with its powerful arms, while its beak tore chunks out of the wooden structure. The crew fought back with axes and spears, but their weapons were useless against something that large and powerful. The creature's skin was too thick to penetrate, and every cut they managed to make seemed to heal almost instantly. Meanwhile, more tentacles kept appearing, grabbing crew members and dragging them down to whatever depths the monster called home. The attack lasted for hours, with the creature methodically demolishing the ship, while the surviving crew huddled together in terror. When dawn broke, the monster finally retreated, leaving behind a vessel so badly damaged that it barely stayed afloat long enough for the survivors to reach the nearest port. Of the 37 men who had been aboard when the attack began, only 12 lived to tell the tale. But squids weren't the only marine predators that posed a threat to medieval ships. Whales, particularly the larger species, could mistake ships for rivals or threats and attack with devastating results. A sperm whale ramming a wooden vessel could punch a hole clean through the hull, sinking the ship in minutes. The survivors would find themselves in the water with the very creature that had just destroyed their means of survival, and whales weren't known for their mercy toward humans in the water. Sharks were another constant threat, drawn by the smell of blood and waste that inevitably accumulated around ships during long voyages. They would follow vessels for weeks, growing bolder and more aggressive as their numbers increased. Crew members who fell overboard, whether by accident or design, would rarely live long enough to be rescued. The sharks had learned to associate ships with easy meals, and they were patient enough to wait for opportunities. But perhaps the most terrifying marine encounters involved creatures that medieval science couldn't explain or classify. Ship's logs from the period are filled with accounts of encounters with animals that seem to defy natural law. Sea serpents hundreds of feet long, fish with human-like faces, creatures that glowed with their own internal light and could hypnotize sailors into jumping overboard. The crew of the merchant vessel Holy Cross reported encountering a school of fish that sang like a choir of angels somewhere in the Mediterranean in 1456. The song was so beautiful that the entire crew was transfixed, standing motionless at the rail while the ship drifted off course. It was only when the ship's cat began yowling in apparent terror that the spell was broken, and the crew discovered that they had been standing there for hours while the singing fish tried to lure them into the water. These encounters weren't just frightening, they were psychologically destructive, challenging everything that medieval sailors thought they knew about the natural world. Men who prided themselves on their practical knowledge and seafaring experience would be reduced to superstitious terror by creatures that shouldn't exist, but clearly did. The ocean's weather patterns themselves seemed malevolent, as if the sea was actively working to destroy anyone who dared to travel on its surface. Ships would sail into areas of perfect calm, only to discover that the stillness wasn't peaceful, it was menacing. The air would become thick and oppressive, making it difficult to breathe. The water would take on an oily quality that reflected light in unnatural ways. And in that unnatural calm, things would begin to go wrong. The ship's compass would spin wildly, pointing in directions that changed from moment to moment. The crew would become disoriented, unable to determine which way was north or even which way was up. Some would report seeing other ships in the distance, vessels that would disappear when approached and reappear in impossible locations. Others would see lights beneath the water, moving in patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose. These dead calms could last for weeks, during which the ship would drift aimlessly while the crew slowly went insane from the oppressive atmosphere and the knowledge that they were completely at the mercy of forces they couldn't understand or control. Food and water would run out while they sat motionless in the middle of an ocean that refused to allow them to make progress toward their destination. And then there were the fogs, thick banks of mist that would roll in without warning and swallow ships completely. These weren't ordinary fogs. They seemed to have substance and weight, pressing down on the vessel like a physical presence. In the fog, sound would behave strangely, with voices carrying impossible distances, while the creaking of the ship's hull would be muffled to whispers. Ships would become lost in these fogs for days or weeks, sailing in circles while their crews gradually realized that they were no longer in the same ocean they had entered. The water would taste different, the air would smell wrong, and the very laws of physics seemed negotiable. Compasses would point to magnetic norths that didn't exist, stars would appear in impossible positions, and time itself would become fluid and unreliable. When the fog finally lifted, ships would often find themselves in locations that should have been impossible to reach, thousands of miles from where they had been when the mist descended. The crew would have aged months or years during what felt like days, their hair white with premature age and their minds fractured by experiences they couldn't adequately describe. The ocean, you see, wasn't just a body of water. It was a living entity with its own agenda, its own intelligence, and its own malevolent sense of humor. It would play with ships like a cat plays with mice, allowing them to think they were making progress before revealing that they had been traveling in circles. It would offer hope in the form of favorable winds, then snatch that hope away with storms that seemed to appear from nowhere. But the worst part, the part that would drive you insane if you thought about it too long, was the knowledge that all of this was just the beginning. The environmental hazards, the predatory sea life, the supernatural phenomena, these were just the opening moves in a game that the ocean had been playing for millennia, and it had never lost. Now, let me tell you about what happened to the human mind when it was subjected to months or years of this maritime hell, because the psychological horror was often worse than any physical torment the ocean could devise. The isolation, the hopelessness, the gradual realization that you were probably going to die far from home and family. These things didn't just break men's spirits, they shattered their very conception of reality and left them as hollow shells barely recognizable as human beings. The isolation was the first weapon in the ocean's psychological arsenal, and it was devastatingly effective. You need to understand that medieval people lived their entire lives surrounded by community, family, neighbors, fellow craftsmen, church congregations. They were never truly alone, never completely cut off from the web of human relationships that gave their lives meaning and structure. But on a ship, especially during the long watches of the night, you would find yourself more alone than any human being was ever meant to be. Standing watch in the darkness, surrounded by an ocean that stretched endlessly in every direction, you would feel the weight of that isolation pressing down on you like a physical force. The stars above were cold and distant, offering no comfort or guidance. The water below was an alien realm where death waited patiently for you to make a single mistake, and the ship beneath your feet was a tiny island of questionable safety in a hostile universe that wanted you dead. This isolation wasn't just physical, it was existential. You were cut off not just from other people, but from everything that had previously given your life meaning. Your work, your family, your community, your very identity were all thousands of miles away, and with each passing day, they seemed less real, more like memories from someone else's life. You began to question whether any of it had ever really existed, or if perhaps you had always been here, alone on this ship, sailing toward a destination that might not exist. The ship's routine was supposed to provide structure and purpose, but after months at sea, even the most essential tasks became mechanical rituals performed by men who no longer remembered why they were doing them. You would trim the sails, not because the wind had changed, but because trimming sails was something you did. You would check the water barrels not because you needed to know how much was left, but because checking water barrels was part of the pattern that kept you from thinking too hard about where you were and what was happening to you. But the most insidious aspect of this psychological deterioration was how it crept up on you gradually. You didn't wake up one morning to discover that you had gone insane. It was a slow erosion of sanity that happened so incrementally that you didn't notice it until it was far too late to do anything about it. First, you would start talking to yourself, just little conversations to break the silence. Then you would start talking to imaginary companions, people who seemed as real as anyone else on the ship. Eventually, these imaginary friends would become more real to you than your actual shipmates, and you would spend hours having elaborate conversations with people who existed only in your fractured mind. The ship's log of the merchant vessel, Blessed Virgin Mary, records the gradual mental collapse of a sailor named William of Chester during a voyage to the Levant in 1423. The entries, written by the ship's clerk, trace William's descent from competent seaman to raving madman over the course of 18 months. At first, William simply became quieter and more withdrawn. Then he began reporting conversations with his dead father, who apparently visited him during his night watches to offer advice about seamanship. By the end of the voyage, William was holding elaborate dinner parties with a dozen imaginary guests, setting out portions of the ship's dwindling food supply for people who existed only in his mind. The other crew members initially found William's behavior amusing, even entertaining, but as his delusions became more elaborate and his grip on reality loosened further, they began to see him as a threat. He would wake up screaming about attacks by enemies who weren't there, or insist that the ship was sinking when it was perfectly seaworthy. Eventually, the crew began to believe that William's madness was contagious, and they avoided him completely, leaving him to live in his own private world of hallucinations and delusions. But William's case wasn't unusual. It was typical. Extended sea voyages created a unique form of mental illness that medieval medicine had no way to understand or treat. The combination of isolation, monotony, poor nutrition, and constant stress created the perfect conditions for psychological breakdown, and almost every crew would have at least one member who succumbed to some form of madness during a long voyage. The ship's officers tried to maintain discipline and structure as a way of combating this psychological deterioration, but their methods often made the problem worse. Punishments for minor infractions became increasingly severe as captains tried to maintain control over crews that were slowly losing their grip on reality. Men would be flogged for imaginary crimes, locked in chains for showing signs of mental instability, or even thrown overboard for displaying behavior that was deemed threatening to the ship's good order. This created a cycle of terror where crew members learned to hide their psychological symptoms rather than seek help, knowing that admitting to mental distress could result in punishment or death. They would suffer in silence, their minds fracturing further with each passing day, until they finally broke completely and did something that endangered themselves or their shipmates. The isolation also bred superstitions that took on lives of their own, becoming more real and powerful than any rational explanation for the hardships the crew endured. Ships developed their own mythologies, complete with ghosts, curses, and malevolent spirits that were held responsible for everything that went wrong. These weren't just stories told to pass the time, they were genuine beliefs that shaped the crew's behavior and decision-making in ways that often made their situation worse. The merchant vessel St. Christopher became convinced that it was haunted by the ghost of a previous crew member who had died during an earlier voyage. Every unexplained noise, every equipment failure, every stroke of bad luck was attributed to this vengeful spirit. The crew spent hours each day performing elaborate rituals designed to appease the ghost, using up precious time and resources that should have been devoted to actually sailing the ship. When men started dying from scurvy and dysentery, The deaths were blamed on the ghosts' anger rather than on the poor conditions and contaminated supplies that were the real culprits. These superstitions weren't just harmless delusions, they were dangerous obsessions that could lead to violence and murder. Crew members who were suspected of being cursed or possessed would be tortured and killed by their shipmates who genuinely believed they were protecting themselves from supernatural threats. The ship's log of the trading vessel Holy Trinity records the execution of 7 crew members who were accused of practicing witchcraft during a voyage to the Baltic in 1467. The accusations were based on nothing more than the coincidence that several men had died shortly after these 7 had been seen talking together, but the remaining crew was so desperate to find someone to blame for their misfortunes that they convinced themselves they were dealing with genuine sorcerers. The psychological pressure of these beliefs created an atmosphere of paranoia and suspicion that poisoned relationships between crew members and made cooperation nearly impossible. Men would refuse to work with anyone they suspected of being cursed or unlucky. They would avoid certain parts of the ship that were believed to be haunted. They would perform elaborate protective rituals before undertaking even the most routine tasks, wasting time and energy that could have been used more productively. But perhaps the most destructive psychological factor was the gradual realization that the voyage might never end. Medieval navigation was so primitive that ships regularly became lost for months or years, sailing in circles while their crews slowly starved to death. The psychological impact of this uncertainty was devastating, as crew members began to suspect that they were trapped in some kind of maritime purgatory where they would sail forever without ever reaching their destination. The ship's clerk of the merchant vessel, Divine Mercy, wrote increasingly desperate entries as their voyage stretched from the planned 6 months to over 2 years. The ship had become lost in the Atlantic, and despite the captain's assurances that they were making progress toward their destination, the crew gradually realized that they had no idea where they were or how to get where they were supposed to be going. The clerk's handwriting became increasingly erratic as he documented the crew's descent into despair and madness, with entries like, Day 847, still no sight of land. The men speak of throwing themselves overboard rather than continue this endless torment. This sense of being trapped in an eternal voyage created a unique form of despair that was qualitatively different from ordinary hopelessness. It wasn't just that the crew expected to die, it was that they began to suspect they might already be dead, that the ship was some kind of ghost vessel sailing through a realm between life and death. This belief led to behaviors that would have been considered insane under normal circumstances, but seemed perfectly rational given their situation. Some crew members would spend hours staring at their reflections in pools of water, trying to determine if they were still alive or had become ghosts without realizing it. Others would perform elaborate tests on themselves, cutting their skin to see if they still bled, or holding their breath to see if they still needed air. A few would become convinced that they were the only living person left on the ship, that all their shipmates had died and been replaced by spirits or demons who were tormenting them as punishment for some forgotten sin. The ship's routine, which had once provided comfort and structure, became a source of additional psychological torment as crew members began to question the purpose of their activities. Why were they still trimming sails if the ship was never going to reach port? Why were they rationing food if they were already dead? Why were they maintaining watch schedules if there was nothing to watch for except more empty ocean? These questions led to a breakdown in discipline that was far more dangerous than simple mutiny. Mutiny was at least rational. It was an attempt to improve conditions or change leadership. But what happened to crews trapped in eternal voyages was a complete abandonment of purpose, a collective decision that nothing mattered anymore because nothing they did would ever make any difference. The merchant vessel, St. Peter, was found drifting empty in 1501, its cargo intact, but its crew vanished without explanation. The ship's log ended abruptly in mid-sentence, with no indication of what had happened to the men who had been sailing it. The only clue was a message carved into the ship's mast. We have decided to go home by a different route. The implication was that the entire crew had thrown themselves overboard, choosing death by drowning over continued existence in their floating prison. But even death wasn't always an escape from the psychological torment of medieval sea travel. Ships would sometimes be found with crews that had been dead for months, their bodies preserved by the cold and salt air, still sitting at their posts, as if they were continuing to sail the ship even in death. These discoveries were so disturbing that they became legendary among sailors who would tell stories of ghost ships crewed by the living dead, forever trying to complete voyages that could never be finished. The ocean, you see, didn't just want to kill you. It wanted to break you first, to strip away everything that made you human before finally claiming your life. It understood that physical death was nothing compared to the destruction of the soul, and it had perfected techniques for psychological torture that were more effective than any instrument of physical torment ever devised. And the most horrifying part was that once the ocean had marked you as its victim, there was no escape, even if you somehow survived the voyage and made it back to land. The psychological scars would follow you for the rest of your life, manifesting as nightmares, hallucinations, and an unshakable conviction that you were still somehow at sea, still trapped in that floating hell where hope went to die. But now, as we reach the end of this journey into maritime horror, let me tell you the final secret that the history books will never reveal. The truth about what happened to those few who actually made it back. Because survival, as it turns out, was just another form of damnation. And the ocean's cruelest joke was letting some of its victims live long enough to understand what they had truly lost. You see, the men who returned from these voyages weren't the same people who had left. They couldn't be. The human mind isn't designed to witness the horrors they had seen, to participate in the atrocities they had committed, to survive the impossible conditions they had endured. Something fundamental had been burned out of them during those months or years at sea, something that could never be restored or replaced. They walked among their families and friends like ghosts, present in body but absent in spirit. Their eyes held an emptiness that spoke of things seen that should never have been witnessed. Their hands shook not from age or infirmity, but from memories of what they had been forced to do with those hands in order to survive. They would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, reliving moments of terror that had been burned into their souls like brands. The merchant sailor Thomas of Winchester returned from a trading voyage to the eastern Mediterranean in 1438, after being gone for 3 years. His wife barely recognized him. He had lost 60 pounds, his hair had gone completely white, and he walked with the careful, measured steps of a man who no longer trusted the ground beneath his feet. But the physical changes were nothing compared to the transformation of his personality. The man who had left Winchester had been jovial and outgoing, known throughout the town for his quick wit and generous nature. The man who returned spoke in whispers when he spoke at all, flinched at sudden noises, and refused to eat meat of any kind. When his wife asked him about his experiences, he would only say, "The ocean remembers everything, and it never forgives." He spent his remaining years sitting by his window, staring eastward toward the sea he could no longer see but could never escape. But Thomas was one of the lucky ones, if you can call it luck. He at least made it home to a family that still remembered him. Many survivors returned to find that they had been given up for dead years earlier, their families remarried, their properties distributed, their very existence erased from the records of their communities. They had become living ghosts, men who existed in a liminal space between life and death, belonging fully to neither world. The church, which was supposed to offer comfort and salvation to all who sought it, didn't know what to do with these survivors. Their confessors would listen in horror to accounts of cannibalism, murder, and spiritual despair that challenged everything the medieval religious worldview held sacred. Some priests refused to grant absolution, declaring that certain sins were beyond the reach of divine forgiveness. Others would go mad themselves, unable to reconcile their faith with the evidence of what human beings were capable of when pushed to their limits. Brother Augustine of the monastery of St. Bede wrote in his personal journal about his encounters with returning sailors. These men speak of things that God surely never intended for human beings to endure. They describe a realm where his light does not reach, where his mercy holds no sway, where the very concept of divine justice becomes meaningless. I begin to wonder if they have returned from hell itself. And if so, what does that say about the nature of our world? The survivors often sought refuge in monasteries, not out of religious conviction, but because they could no longer function in normal society. The regulated life of prayer and contemplation offered structure and purpose to men whose minds had been shattered by chaos and meaninglessness. But even in these sacred spaces, they remained haunted by their experiences, often speaking of visions and dreams that suggested their ordeal at sea had opened doorways in their minds that could never be closed. The monastery of St. Columba in Scotland became known as a refuge for survivors of maritime disasters, and its records provide a chilling glimpse into the long-term effects of extreme sea voyages. The monks wrote of brothers who would sleepwalk to the edge of cliffs, drawn by voices they claimed to hear calling from the ocean. Others would refuse to bathe, saying that water was their enemy and would try to drag them back to the depths. Some would construct elaborate shrines to shipmates who had died during their voyages, carrying on conversations with the dead as if they were still present. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these survivors' experiences was their relationship with time itself. Many reported that they had lost the ability to perceive time normally, that months would pass like days, while minutes could stretch into hours. They claimed that part of them was still at sea, still trapped in that eternal voyage where time had no meaning and suffering had no end. This temporal displacement made it impossible for them to form normal relationships or participate in the rhythms of terrestrial life. The merchant captain Geoffrey of Marseille returned from a voyage to North Africa in 1445, after being at sea for 4 years. He insisted that only 6 months had passed and no amount of evidence could convince him otherwise. He would show up for appointments on the wrong days, age at an accelerated rate while insisting he was getting younger, and speak of events that hadn't happened yet, as if they were ancient history. His family eventually had him declared incompetent and confined to his home, where he spent his remaining years drawing obsessively detailed maps of oceans that didn't exist. The ocean, it seemed, had claimed these men even though it had allowed them to return to land. They carried pieces of it within them, fragments of that alien realm that continued to exert influence over their thoughts and actions. They were walking ambassadors from a world that operated by different rules, living proof that there were places in the universe where human beings simply did not belong, and the ocean wasn't finished with them. Ship's logs and personal accounts from the period are filled with reports of survivors being drawn back to the sea against their will, compelled by forces they couldn't understand or resist. Men who had sworn never to set foot on another ship would find themselves walking toward the docks in the middle of the night with no memory of how they had gotten there or why they felt such an overwhelming urge to return to the water. The merchant sailor Peter of Hamburg survived a disastrous voyage to the Baltic in 1467, returning home after 2 years of unimaginable hardship. He settled into a quiet life as a shopkeeper, married a local woman, and seemed to have successfully put his maritime experiences behind him. But 10 years later, his neighbors found his shop abandoned and Peter himself missing. He was discovered 3 days later on a beach 50 miles away, sitting naked in the surf and speaking to invisible companions about preparations for a voyage that existed only in his fractured mind. These compulsions weren't just psychological. They seemed to have a physical component that defied rational explanation. Survivors would develop an uncanny ability to predict storms, changes in tide, and other maritime phenomena, even when they were hundreds of miles inland. They would become agitated and restless before major shipwrecks occurred, as if they could sense disturbances in the ocean's mood from vast distances. The widow of a survivor named James of Cork wrote to the local bishop in 1489, describing how her husband would become violently ill whenever ships were lost at sea, even if those ships were on the other side of the continent. He would wake up screaming about drowning men he had never met, describe in perfect detail ships he had never seen, and weep for crews who had died without anyone on land knowing they were in danger. The bishop's reply, preserved in the church archives, simply stated that some experiences were too profound for the human soul to bear, and that perhaps death would have been a kindness compared to the burden James carried. But the most chilling aspect of these survivors' stories was what they revealed about the true nature of the ocean itself. They spoke consistently of the sea as a living entity with its own intelligence, its own agenda, and its own malevolent sense of purpose. This wasn't metaphorical language or poetic expression. These men genuinely believed that the ocean was conscious, that it made deliberate choices about who lived and who died, and that it took pleasure in the suffering it inflicted. They described a presence that would visit ships during the darkest hours, manifesting as voices in the wind, shadows in the water, or feelings of being watched by something vast and ancient and utterly alien. This presence would whisper promises of safe passage in exchange for sacrifices, offer bargains that seemed reasonable until their true cost became apparent, and provide just enough hope to keep crews alive long enough to experience maximum despair when that hope was inevitably crushed. The ocean, according to these accounts, didn't just want to kill, it wanted to corrupt, to transform, to claim souls as well as lives. It would offer survival to those willing to compromise their humanity, forcing them to choose between death and damnation. Those who chose survival would be marked forever, carrying within them a piece of the ocean's darkness that would influence their thoughts and actions for the rest of their lives. This explains why so many survivors felt compelled to return to the sea, why they could never fully adapt to life on land, why they remained haunted by experiences that seemed to exist outside normal time and space. They weren't just traumatized. They had been fundamentally altered at a spiritual level, transformed into something that was no longer entirely human. And here's the final horror, the ultimate revelation that makes this entire tale of maritime nightmare complete. The ocean is still out there, still playing the same game it has played for millennia, still claiming victims with the same methods it perfected on those medieval ships. The technology has changed, the ships are larger and more sophisticated, but the fundamental dynamic remains the same. The sea is still a hostile alien realm where human beings do not belong, and it still takes pleasure in reminding us of that fact. Modern maritime disasters like the Titanic, the Lusitania, the Estonia, these aren't just accidents or tragedies. They're a continuation of an ancient pattern, fresh chapters in a story that began when the first human being decided to challenge the ocean's dominion. The survivors of these modern disasters report the same psychological symptoms, the same spiritual corruption, the same sense of having been marked by forces beyond human understanding. So the next time you look out at the ocean and feel that romantic urge to explore, to adventure, to seek your fortune across the waves, remember what I've told you tonight. Remember the medieval sailors who thought they were different, who believed they were stronger, who convinced themselves that they could survive what had killed so many others? Remember how wrong they were and how their wrongness cost them not just their lives, but their souls. The ocean is patient. It has all the time in the world. And it's always hungry for new victims who think they're somehow special, somehow different from all the others who have fed its endless appetite for human suffering. You might survive the voyage, just as some of those medieval sailors did. But survival, as we've seen, is just another form of damnation, another way for the ocean to claim you as its own. And once it has claimed you, it never lets you go. Never. The medieval sailors learned this truth too late to save themselves. But perhaps, if you're wise, you can learn from their example. Stay on land, stay safe, stay human. Because the alternative is worse than death. It's becoming something else entirely, something that belongs not to the world of the living, but to the vast, dark, patient realm that waits beneath the waves, counting its victories and planning its next move in a game where it has never lost and never will.